The story of how he survived is almost certainly false. It matters anyway. According to Herodotus, writing a century after the events he described, the Median king Astyages dreamed one night that a vine grew from the womb of his daughter Mandane and spread until it covered all of Asia. The court interpreters understood the message. Mandane's child would overthrow his grandfather and rule in his place. Astyages, determined to prevent what the gods had shown him, married his daughter not to a Median noble who might prove ambitious, but to a Persian vassal, Cambyses, king of Anshan, a minor ruler of a subject people unlikely to threaten Median supremacy. When Mandane became pregnant, Astyages summoned her to Ecbatana and ordered his most trusted official, a nobleman named Harpagus, to take the child when it was born and kill it. Harpagus received the infant but could not bring himself to commit murder with his own hands. He passed the baby to a herdsman named Mithridates, commanding him to expose it in the mountains where wild animals would accomplish what Harpagus could not. The herdsman's wife had just delivered a stillborn child. She looked at the living infant in her husband's arms and begged him to substitute the bodies, bury her dead baby on the mountainside and raise the Persian prince as their own. Mithridates agreed. The boy who should have died grew up among shepherds, knowing nothing of his origins. 10 years later, the child was discovered. Playing with other village boys, he had organized them into a mock kingdom and taken the role of king himself. When a nobleman's son refused to obey his commands, the shepherd boy had him beaten. The nobleman complained to Astyages, who summoned the child to court. Something in the boy's bearing, his refusal to show fear, his natural authority, stirred recognition in the king. Investigation revealed the truth, and Astyages learned that his grandson had survived. The king's rage fell not on the child, but on Harpagus, the man who had disobeyed him. Astyages invited Harpagus to a feast and served him the flesh of his own son, revealing what he had done only after Harpagus had eaten. As for the boy, the interpreters now suggested that the dream had been fulfilled harmlessly. He had been king among village children, and no further danger remained. Astyages sent his grandson back to Persia, to his real parents, convinced that fate had been satisfied. Harpagus never forgot. Neither did the boy. Other versions of the story existed. Ctesias, a Greek physician who served at the Persian court generations later, told a different tale entirely, one in which Cyrus was not related to Astyages at all, but rose from common origins through ability alone. The Persians themselves may have told still other versions, stories that did not survive because the Greeks who wrote them down preferred their own dramatic narratives. What matters is not which version is true. What matters is that from the very beginning, Cyrus existed at the intersection of legend and history, a figure whose life would be shaped as much by the stories told about him as by what he actually did. The world he was born into, around 600 BC, was divided among great powers that had dominated the Near East for generations. The Median Empire ruled from Ecbatana, its authority stretching from eastern Anatolia to the borders of Central Asia. Astyages had inherited this realm from his father Cyaxares, who had helped destroy the Assyrian Empire and established Media as one of the 4 great kingdoms that divided the Assyrian inheritance. The Medes were an Iranian people related to the Persians by language and culture, but they had organized themselves into an empire, while the Persians remained a collection of tribes paying tribute to Median overlords. To the west, the kingdom of Lydia controlled western Anatolia from its capital at Sardis. King Croesus, whose name would become synonymous with wealth, ruled over lands rich in gold from the river Pactolus. lands that generated the first coined money in human history. A treaty in 585 BC had fixed the border between Media and Lydia at the Halys River, a boundary that both kingdoms respected because neither could easily cross it. To the south, Babylon dominated Mesopotamia under the Chaldean dynasty, its hanging gardens and massive walls, making it the greatest city in the world. Egypt, ancient and proud, maintained its independence along the Nile. These four powers, Media, Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt, held the Near East in a balance that had lasted for decades. Persia was not among them. The Persians occupied the highlands east of Mesopotamia, a land of mountain valleys and high plains called Fars, the region that would eventually give its name to the entire country. They were vassals of the Medes, ruled by the Achaemenid dynasty that traced its lineage back to a semi-legendary ancestor named Achaemenes. Cambyses I, Cyrus's father, held the title King of Anshan. But the title meant little when Median armies could march through Persian territory at will, and Median kings could summon Persian rulers to appear at their court. The Persians lived simply compared to their overlords. They raised horses on grasslands that bred some of the finest cavalry mounts in the ancient world. They valued horsemanship, archery, and truth-telling. Herodotus would later claim that Persian boys were taught three things: to ride, to shoot, and to speak the truth. Their religion may already have been influenced by Zoroastrian teachings that emphasized the cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood, light and darkness, though the exact nature of Persian beliefs in this period remains unclear. Cyrus grew up between two worlds. His mother, Mandane, connected him to the Median royal house, to the wealth of Ecbatana, to the imperial traditions that had governed the region for generations. His father, Cambyses, represented Persian identity, the tribal loyalties, the martial virtues, the simpler customs that distinguished Persians from their more sophisticated overlords. The boy who had been raised among herdsmen and then returned to a vassal king's court understood both the common people and the nobility, both servitude and authority. The sources suggest he was patient, observant, capable of winning loyalty through fairness, rather than demanding it through force. Men followed him because they wanted to, not because they feared what would happen if they refused. In a world where kings maintained power through terror and armies, this quality set him apart. It would become the foundation of everything he built. By the time Cyrus reached adulthood, tensions between Persia and Media had been building for years. The Persians chafed under tribute obligations that enriched Ecbatana, while impoverishing their own lands. Median officials treated Persian nobles with contempt, extracting resources without offering respect in return. The balance that Astyages thought he had secured by marrying his daughter to a Persian vassal was producing exactly the opposite of what he intended. When Cambyses I died, around 559 BC, his son inherited a kingdom that was not really a kingdom, a vassal state whose king could be summoned to Ecbatana like a servant. Cyrus accepted the throne of Anshan, performed the required obeisances to Astyages, and gave no outward sign that anything would change. But something had already changed. The grandson who should have died in the mountains was now a king. The boy whose fate the interpreters had dismissed as fulfilled through childhood games was now a man with an army of horsemen loyal to him personally. And somewhere in Ecbatana, an old nobleman named Harpagus was waiting, still carrying the memory of the feast where he had eaten his own son, still planning revenge against the king who had destroyed his family. The vine from Astyages' dream was about to grow, and it would not stop until it covered all of Asia. The new king of Anshan spent his first years doing nothing that alarmed his overlord. Cyrus paid his tribute. He sent the required gifts to Ecbatana. He appeared at Astyages' court when summoned and performed the rituals of submission that vassal kings had always performed. If the Median king remembered the prophecy about the vine, if he wondered whether sending his grandson back to Persia had been a mistake, he saw nothing in Cyrus's behavior to confirm his fears. The young Persian ruler seemed content with his subordinate position. What Astyages did not see was happening in the highlands. Cyrus was uniting the Persian tribes, not through conquest, but through persuasion. He traveled among them, listened to their grievances, settled disputes with judgments that both sides accepted as fair. He reminded them of their common heritage, their shared customs, their collective resentment of Median taxation and Median contempt. He offered a vision of what they might become if they stood together rather than competing against each other for scraps of Median favor. The tribal chiefs who met him came away impressed by a king who treated them as allies rather than subjects. He asked for their counsel rather than demanding their obedience. He shared meals with them as an equal rather than requiring them to prostrate themselves before his throne. By the time Astyages began to suspect that something was changing in Persia, Cyrus had transformed a collection of quarreling tribes into something approaching a unified people. The messages from Harpagus had been arriving secretly for years. The Median nobleman had never forgotten the feast where Astyages had fed him his own son's flesh. He had spent decades nursing his hatred, waiting for an opportunity that finally seemed to be arriving. In letters smuggled to Persia, hidden inside the belly of a gutted hare, so Herodotus tells us, Harpagus urged Cyrus to revolt. He promised that the Median army would not fight for a king its commanders despised. He pledged his own defection and that of other nobles who shared his grievances. Cyrus moved carefully. He tested Harpagus's promises by probing Median resolve, gauging how the garrisons responded, identifying which commanders might switch sides when the moment came. Only when he was certain that the Median Empire was rotting from within did he make his rebellion open. The break came around 553 BC. Cyrus refused the tribute, rejected Astyages' authority, and proclaimed Persian independence. The gesture was more than symbolic. It was a declaration that the old order had ended and a new one was beginning. Astyages responded as any Median king would have. He summoned his armies and marched to crush the rebellion before it could spread. The Persians were vassals, their military strength a fraction of Median power. The campaign should have been brief. It was brief, but not in the way Astyages expected. He made the catastrophic mistake of giving command of the army to Harpagus, the same Harpagus who had been plotting with Cyrus for years, the same Harpagus who had waited decades for this moment of revenge. When the Median forces met the Persian army near Pasargadae, Harpagus led his contingent directly over to Cyrus's side. Other units, seeing the defection, chose to follow rather than fight for a king whose own commanders had abandoned him. The battle became a rout. Astyages fled back to Ecbatana with whatever forces remained loyal, but his empire was already collapsing. The defections that Harpagus had promised spread through the Median military and administrative structure. Officials who had served Astyages for decades now calculated that survival lay in accommodating the rising Persian power rather than defending a falling Median one. Cyrus pursued and captured Ecbatana around 550 BC. Astyages himself was taken prisoner. The grandfather who had ordered his infant grandson killed, who had punished Harpagus with unspeakable cruelty, who had ruled the largest empire in the world, now found himself at the mercy of the child who should have died on a mountainside. What happened next established the pattern that would define Cyrus's reign. He did not execute Astyages. He did not torture him, parade him in humiliation, or make an example of his cruelty. Cyrus treated his defeated grandfather with respect, providing him with an honorable household and allowing him to live out his remaining years in comfort. The man who had every reason for vengeance chose mercy instead. The decision was not merely personal, it was political genius. By sparing Astyages, Cyrus signaled to every other kingdom watching that surrender to Persian forces did not mean destruction. He demonstrated that the Persian way of war was different from what the Near East had known for centuries. The mass deportations of Assyria, the savage punishments that empires had traditionally inflicted on the defeated. He offered an alternative. Submit, and your life would be preserved. Cooperate, and your position might be maintained. Resist and face the consequences. But even then, mercy remained possible. The Medes themselves were not treated as a conquered people. Cyrus adopted Median court customs, retained Median officials in their positions, dressed in Median royal robes for formal occasions. He presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a legitimate successor to the Median throne. His mother's bloodline gave him a claim, and his victory proved divine favor. Persians and Medes would share in the administration of the new empire, their elites intermarrying, their identities blurring into a ruling partnership. The empire that emerged was something new, not Persian domination of Media, but a union in which both peoples held privileged positions. Later Greeks would sometimes struggle to distinguish Persians from Medes, using the terms almost interchangeably, because Cyrus had deliberately fused the two into a single imperial people. News of Astyages' fall rippled across the ancient world, and everywhere it arrived, kings began to worry. Croesus of Lydia watched his eastern neighbor suddenly transform from a familiar rival into an unknown quantity. The treaty that had fixed the border at the Halys River had been made with Media. Did it still bind this new Persian power? Croesus began strengthening his alliances, sending envoys to Babylon and Egypt and even distant Sparta, preparing for a confrontation that now seemed inevitable. Nabonidus of Babylon performed calculations of his own. His kingdom shared a long border with what had been Media and was now Persia. The buffer states that had separated Babylon from the Medes no longer existed. A new power was rising, and no one knew where its ambitions would end. Egypt watched from the Nile, secure behind its deserts, but aware that the balance of power in the Near East had fundamentally shifted. The four-kingdom system that had maintained stability for decades was now a three-kingdom system, and the third kingdom, this Persian-Median union, was larger than the other two combined. Cyrus stood at the center of these concerns, master of an empire stretching from the borders of Anatolia to the mountains of Central Asia. He was perhaps 40 years old. The child of legend had become a king of consequence, but he was not finished. The empire he had inherited from the Medes was only the beginning. The wealth of Lydia beckoned from the west. The ancient cities of Babylon waited to the south. The world that had seemed so stable for so long was about to be remade entirely. And the man who would remake it was just getting started. Croesus of Lydia made the first move, and it destroyed him. The Lydian king had watched the Persian conquest of Media with growing alarm. His eastern border, once secured by treaty with a familiar power, now faced an empire of unknown intentions, led by a king whose ambitions seemed boundless. Croesus decided that striking first was safer than waiting to be struck. He would cross the Halys River, crush this Persian upstart before he grew any stronger. and restore the balance of power that had kept Lydia safe for generations. Before marching, Croesus consulted the oracle at Delphi, the most respected source of divine guidance in the Greek world. He asked whether he should make war on the Persians. The oracle's response became one of history's most famous examples of prophetic ambiguity. If Croesus crossed the Halys, a great empire would fall. Croesus heard what he wanted to hear. He crossed the Halys in 547 BC with the finest army gold could buy. Lydian cavalry renowned throughout the ancient world, Greek mercenaries from the Ionian cities, allies drawn by Lydian wealth and the promise of Persian plunder. He advanced into Cappadocia, the borderland between Lydia and what had been Media, expecting Cyrus to retreat or negotiate. Cyrus did neither. The Battle of Tyria was inconclusive. Both armies fought, both withdrew. Neither achieved decisive victory. But the aftermath revealed the difference between the two kings. Croesus, following standard military practice, dismissed his mercenaries for the winter and retreated to Sardis, planning to reassemble an even larger force in the spring. He sent messages to his allies in Babylon, Egypt, and Sparta, requesting reinforcements for the campaign's season ahead. Cyrus followed him. No one campaigned in winter. Armies disbanded when the harvest ended and reformed when spring made movement possible again. The entire rhythm of ancient warfare assumed that winter was a pause, a time for preparation rather than action. Cyrus ignored the assumption. He marched his forces across Anatolia through the cold months, arriving before Sardis, while Croesus was still waiting for allies who would never come in time. The Lydians scrambled to meet the unexpected attack. Croesus deployed his cavalry, his greatest military asset, on the plain before the city. The Lydian horsemen were famous, their charges devastating, their mounts trained to trample infantry beneath their hooves. Cyrus countered with camels. He positioned his baggage camels at the front of his formation, knowing that horses which had never encountered camels would panic at their unfamiliar scent and appearance. The Lydian horses did exactly that. They reared, refused commands, threw their riders, and transformed what should have been a devastating cavalry charge into chaos. The Lydian riders dismounted and fought on foot, bravely but hopelessly, as Persian forces overwhelmed them. The Battle of Timbra ended Lydian military power in an afternoon. Croesus retreated into Sardis, trusting in walls that had never been breached, expecting a siege that would last until his allies arrived. The siege lasted 14 days. Persian soldiers found an unguarded point where the cliffs seemed too steep to require defense, climbed it, and opened the gates from within. Croesus fell into Cyrus's hands, and once again, the Persian king chose mercy. The sources disagree on exactly what happened. Herodotus tells of Croesus placed on a pyre, saved at the last moment when he called out the name of Solon, the Athenian sage who had once warned him that no man should be called happy until he was dead. Other accounts suggest Cyrus never intended execution, that the pyre story was legend rather than history. What seems certain is that Croesus survived, that Cyrus treated him with respect, and that the man who had been the richest king in the world lived out his days as an advisor at the Persian court. The pattern established with Astyages repeated. Defeat did not mean death. Surrender did not mean humiliation. Cyrus was building a reputation that made resistance seem foolish and submission seem safe. The Greek cities of the Ionian coast, Miletus, Ephesus, and others that had been Lydian subjects, now faced a choice. Most submitted without serious resistance. Cyrus offered them terms similar to what they had known under Lydia: local autonomy, continued trade, reasonable tribute. The cities that had flourished under Lydian rule could flourish under Persian rule. Those that resisted learned that Persian mercy had limits, but even conquered cities were incorporated rather than destroyed. Cyrus did not linger in the West. He appointed governors, established garrisons, and delegated the consolidation of Lydia to subordinates. His attention had already turned eastward, toward frontiers that required attention and peoples that had not yet acknowledged Persian supremacy. The eastern campaigns of the 500s 40s BC are less documented than the conquest of Lydia. Greek historians cared more about events that touched the Greek world than about wars in distant Central Asia. But the results were unmistakable. Cyrus pushed Persian authority into Parthia, into Bactria, into Sogdiana, regions that would remain part of successive Persian empires for centuries. He reached the edges of the Indian subcontinent, incorporating Gandhara into territories that now stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Hindu Kush. These were not empty conquests. The eastern provinces controlled the trade routes that connected the Mediterranean world to China and India, the pathways along which silk and spices and precious stones would travel for millennia. Whoever held Bactria and Sogdiana held the keys to commerce across the entire Asian continent. Cyrus was not merely accumulating territory. He was assembling the infrastructure of a world economy. He also built his capital. Pasargadae rose in the Persian heartland, near the site where his forces had defeated the Median army, where Harpagus' defection had turned the tide of history. The city was unlike anything the region had seen. Not a fortress designed for defense, but a ceremonial center designed for display. Gardens watered by sophisticated irrigation systems surrounded palaces built from white limestone that gleamed in the mountain sun. The architecture blended influences from every culture Cyrus had conquered. Median columns, Lydian stonework, Babylonian motifs, all synthesized into something distinctively Persian. The palace gates bore a winged figure that scholars still debate, perhaps a representation of Cyrus himself, perhaps a protective spirit, perhaps a symbol of royal authority that transcended any individual king. An inscription nearby declared in 3 languages, "I am Cyrus, the king, an Achaemenid." It was a statement of identity for an empire that was still defining what it meant to be Persian. By 540 BC, Cyrus ruled more territory than any human being had ever ruled before. His empire stretched 3,000 miles from the Mediterranean to Central Asia, encompassing dozens of peoples, hundreds of cities, millions of subjects who spoke languages he could not understand and worshipped gods he did not know. He had conquered the Medes, the Lydians, and the peoples of the eastern mountains. He had demonstrated that Persian power could reach anywhere, that resistance was futile, that accommodation offered better prospects than defiance. But the greatest prize still remained. Babylon, the ancient city, the center of Mesopotamian civilization, the seat of kings who traced their authority back thousands of years, still stood independent. Its walls were legendary, its wealth unmatched, its temples home to gods who had been worshipped since before the Persians existed as a people. And Babylon was weak. Its king, Nabonidus, had alienated the priesthood through religious reforms that offended traditional sensibilities. Its people were restive, its army demoralized, its position increasingly isolated as Persian power encircled it from north, east, and west. The city that had once ruled empires was about to meet the man who was building a greater one. Cyrus began preparing his forces for the campaign that would make him master of the ancient world. Babylon had stood for 2,000 years, and its walls had never been breached. The city sprawled across both banks of the Euphrates, protected by fortifications that seemed to mock the very idea of siege warfare. The outer walls stretched for miles, thick enough for chariots to pass along their tops, high enough that scaling ladders would barely reach their midpoint. The inner walls were stronger still, and between them lay a moat fed by the river itself. Babylon had weathered Assyrian sieges, Elamite attacks, and centuries of Near Eastern warfare. Its defenses had been designed by engineers who understood that the city must never fall. Behind those walls lived perhaps 200,000 people, the largest urban population in the world. Temples rose above the rooftops, ziggurats reaching toward heaven, sanctuaries where priests had maintained rituals since before Abraham left Ur. The great temple of Marduk, patron god of Babylon, dominated the sacred precinct. Its wealth accumulated over generations of offerings from kings who sought divine favor. The hanging gardens, if they existed at all, demonstrated engineering as ambitious as the walls themselves. Terraces of greenery rising above the flat Mesopotamian plain. This was the prize Cyrus intended to take, and he would take it almost without fighting. The opportunity came from Babylon's own king. Nabonidus had ruled since 556 BC, but his reign had been strange from the beginning. He was not of the royal line. He had come to power through what may have been a coup, and he had pursued religious policies that alienated the very priesthood on which Babylonian kingship depended. He elevated the moon god Sin above Marduk, neglected the New Year's festival that legitimized royal authority, and spent years away from Babylon at the Arabian oasis of Taima, while his son Belshazzar governed in his absence. The priests of Marduk watched their temples lose precedence, their rituals ignored, their god subordinated to a deity their kings seemed to prefer. They kept records of Nabonidus's offenses, documented his failures to perform the sacred duties of Babylonian kingship, and waited for an alternative. Cyrus offered himself as that alternative. Persian agents worked the discontent that Nabonidus had created. They spread word that Cyrus respected the gods of conquered peoples, that he restored temples rather than plundering them, that his rule brought order rather than chaos. The message reached willing ears among Babylonian priests and merchants who had prospered under previous kings, and now watched Nabonidus squander their city's position through neglect and heterodoxy. The campaign began in 539 BC, and it moved with the inexorable quality that characterized all of Cyrus's wars. Persian forces advanced down the Tigris, securing the territories east of Babylon, cutting the city off from potential allies. In early October, they met the Babylonian army at Opis, north of the capital. The battle was decisive. Babylonian forces broke, and the road to the city lay open. Sippar, the last major fortress before Babylon itself, surrendered without resistance. The commanders who should have defended it calculated that their futures lay with the conqueror, rather than with a king whom the gods themselves seemed to have abandoned. What happened next entered legend through multiple tellings. Herodotus, writing a century later, described how Cyrus diverted the Euphrates into a basin, lowering the water level until his soldiers could wade through the riverbed that passed beneath Babylon's walls. They entered while the city celebrated a festival, its inhabitants too drunk or distracted to notice, until Persian troops were already inside. The Book of Daniel, written later still, placed the conquest on the night of Belshazzar's feast, when a mysterious hand wrote words of doom on the palace wall. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, and Belshazzar was slain before morning. The contemporary evidence tells a different story, or rather, the same story without the drama. The Nabonidus Chronicle, a Babylonian document recording events as they happened, states simply that Cyrus's forces entered Babylon on October 12th, 539 BC, without battle. The general Ugbaru, also called Gobrias, led the troops that took the city, secured the palace, and captured Nabonidus himself. There was no siege, no storming of walls, no massacre. The greatest city in the world changed hands as peacefully as a business transaction. Cyrus himself entered 17 days later, on October 29th. His arrival was staged as a liberation rather than a conquest. He came not as a foreign destroyer, but as a restorer of proper order, a king chosen by Marduk himself to repair the damage that Nabonidus had done. The priests who had suffered under Nabonidus welcomed him as a deliverer. The merchants who needed stability welcomed him as a guarantee of continued prosperity. The people who had watched their king neglect his duties welcomed anyone who promised to perform them properly. The Cyrus cylinder proclaimed this message in the conqueror's own words, or at least in the words his scribes composed for the occasion. This clay cylinder, inscribed in Babylonian cuneiform and buried in the city's foundations, presented Cyrus's conquest as an act of divine will. Marduk, angered by Nabonidus's impiety, had searched the world for a righteous king and chosen Cyrus to restore proper worship. The text catalogued Nabonidus's crimes, his neglect of temples, his oppression of the people, his offenses against the gods, and contrasted them with Cyrus's piety and justice. It announced the return of exiled peoples to their homelands, the restoration of sanctuaries throughout Mesopotamia, the beginning of a new era of prosperity under Persian rule. The cylinder was propaganda, sophisticated and deliberate, but propaganda works because it contains enough truth to be believable. Cyrus did restore temples. He did permit exiled peoples to return home. He did present himself as a servant of the gods rather than their rival. The message may have been calculated, but the policies it described were real. Cyrus assumed titles that connected him to the full weight of Mesopotamian tradition. He became king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the four corners of the world, titles that previous Babylonian rulers had borne, now transferred to a Persian who had never worshipped Marduk until conquest made it politically useful. He performed the rituals that Nabonidus had neglected, grasping the hands of Marduk's statue in the ceremony that legitimized Babylonian kingship. He presented himself not as a conqueror imposing foreign rule, but as a rightful king restoring proper order. The religious establishments of Mesopotamia received their temples back, their revenues restored, their privileges confirmed. Whatever Cyrus personally believed, and his own religious views remain unclear, he understood that gods were political forces, that priesthoods controlled populations, that legitimacy required divine sanction. He gave the priests what they wanted, and they gave him what he needed: acceptance as a rightful ruler rather than a foreign tyrant. With Babylon came everything Babylon controlled. The former Babylonian territories in Syria and the Levant now acknowledged Persian authority. The trade routes that connected Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean now fed Persian treasuries. The administrative systems that Babylonian scribes had developed over centuries now served Persian purposes. Cyrus had absorbed not just a city, but a civilization, and he had absorbed it intact, functioning, ready to serve new masters. He was now ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from the Aegean to the borders of India, from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf. He held 4 capitals: Pasargadae, Ecbatana, Babylon, and Susa, each representing a different tradition, each contributing its expertise to the imperial administration. He commanded resources beyond calculation, populations beyond counting, territories beyond the ability of any single person to visit in a lifetime. The child of legend had become something no legend could have predicted. Now he would have to govern what he had conquered. The empire that Cyrus ruled defied every precedent for how empires were supposed to work. Previous conquerors had governed through terror. The Assyrians had made mass deportation and public torture into instruments of state policy, flaying rebellious kings alive and displaying their skins on city walls. The message was clear: resist and suffer horrors beyond imagination. Submit and be spared the worst. Fear held empires together because nothing else seemed capable of controlling populations that had no reason to love their rulers. Cyrus offered something different. He offered tolerance. The system he developed, refined over years of conquest and administration, allowed subject peoples to maintain their identities while acknowledging Persian supremacy. Local religions continued. Local customs persisted. Local elites retained their positions as long as they cooperated with imperial demands. The Persians did not impose their gods on conquered peoples or demand cultural conformity. They demanded tribute, military support when required, and loyalty to the king. Beyond that, subjects could live as they had always lived. The satrapies organized this diversity into something manageable. Each province, and the empire eventually contained over 20, was governed by a satrap, typically a Persian noble appointed by the king and answerable to him alone. The satrap collected tribute, maintained order, administered justice, and commanded whatever military forces his province required. He lived like a king in his own territory, surrounded by a court that replicated on a smaller scale the magnificence of the imperial center. But he served at the king's pleasure, and royal inspectors, the eyes and ears of the king, traveled the empire reporting on satrapal conduct, ensuring that governors did not become too independent or too corrupt. The system balanced local autonomy against central control. Satraps had enough authority to govern effectively, without constant reference to distant capitals. But they knew they were watched, knew that disloyalty would be discovered and punished, knew that their positions depended on continued royal favor. The arrangement worked because it acknowledged reality. An empire stretching thousands of miles could not be administered from a single location, but it could be supervised through networks of information and accountability. Roads made the supervision possible. The royal road stretched over 1,600 miles from Sardis to Susa, with posting stations every 15 miles where fresh horses waited for royal messengers. A traveller on foot would need 90 days to walk the distance. The imperial courier service could cover it in a week. Information flowed from the provinces to the capitals and back again, with a speed that made Persian administration seem almost supernatural to peoples accustomed to the slow pace of ancient communication. The tribute that flowed along these roads funded everything else. Each satrapy owed specific amounts, calculated according to its wealth and population. Gold and silver, of course, but also horses from Media, camels from Arabia, ebony and ivory from Ethiopia, grain from the fertile crescents of Mesopotamia and Egypt. The treasure accumulated in royal storehouses became a reserve that could fund armies, build palaces, and survive years of crisis without requiring new exactions from exhausted populations. Cyrus was building not just an empire, but a fiscal system that could sustain itself across generations. Among the peoples who benefited from Persian tolerance, none remembered Cyrus more gratefully than the Jews. Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BC, demolished the temple that Solomon had built, and deported the Jewish elite to Babylon. For nearly 50 years, the exiles had maintained their identity in a foreign land, mourning what they had lost, praying for restoration. preserving traditions that separation from their homeland made all the more precious. They had watched Babylonian kings come and go, waiting for the deliverance their prophets had promised. Cyrus delivered it in 538 BC. The year after taking Babylon, he issued a decree permitting the Jewish exiles to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple. The biblical books of Ezra and Chronicles preserve what they present as his actual words. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem. Whether Cyrus actually invoked the Jewish God, or whether the biblical writers adapted his decree to their theological purposes, the policy was real. Jews who wished to return could return. The temple would be rebuilt at royal expense. The sacred vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had plundered would be restored. Not all the exiles chose to return. Many had built lives in Babylon that they were reluctant to abandon, but enough did to re-establish a Jewish presence in Jerusalem that continues to this day. The second temple that rose from the ruins would stand for nearly 600 years, until Roman legions destroyed it in 70 AD. For Jews across the centuries, Cyrus became a unique figure, the only non-Jew the Hebrew Bible calls Messiah, the anointed one chosen by God to fulfill divine purposes. The prophet Isaiah, writing during or shortly after the exile, declared that God had called Cyrus by name, had taken him by the right hand, had opened doors before him so that he might accomplish what God intended. It was an extraordinary statement. A pagan king serving the God of Israel, a foreign conqueror as an instrument of salvation. But it reflected what the exiles experienced: liberation from a king who had dishonored the gods, and restoration under a king who honored them all. Cyrus governed from multiple capitals, each serving different functions. Pasargadae remained the ceremonial heart of Persian identity, the place where kings were crowned and the founder's legacy was preserved. Ecbatana, the old Median capital, served as a summer residence, its mountain elevation providing relief from the heat that made lowland cities unbearable. Babylon offered proximity to the wealthy Mesopotamian provinces and access to the administrative traditions that Babylonian scribes had developed over millennia. Susa, ancient and strategically located, would become increasingly important under Cyrus's successors. The king moved among these capitals with his court, a mobile government that brought royal presence to different regions, rather than requiring subjects always to travel to him. The practice demonstrated that the empire belonged to all its peoples, not just to Persians, that the king was as much at home in Babylon as in Pasargadae. His household reflected the same cosmopolitan character. His wife Cassandane, whom the sources describe as deeply beloved, bore him at least 2 sons and several daughters. The eldest son, Cambyses, was groomed for succession, learning the arts of war and governance that kingship would require. The younger son, Bardia, whom the Greeks called Smerdis, received territories of his own to administer. Daughters married into the Persian nobility, creating alliances that bound the great families to the royal house. When Cassandane died, the grief that Cyrus displayed suggested that political marriage had become genuine love. He ordered mourning throughout the empire, a public acknowledgement of private loss that humanized a king who might otherwise have seemed impossibly remote. The tomb he built for her demonstrated that Persian kings could honor their queens as partners rather than mere instruments of dynasty. The Persian virtues that Cyrus embodied shaped how his subjects understood his rule. Truth-telling stood at the center of Persian ethics. Herodotus noted that Persian boys were taught above all to speak the truth, and that lying was considered the most shameful of all behaviors. The emphasis may have reflected Zoroastrian influence, with its cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood, or it may have predated Zoroaster entirely. Either way, Cyrus presented himself as a king who kept his word, whose promises could be trusted, whose dealings were honest even with enemies. This reputation had practical value. Peoples considering submission could believe that the terms offered would be honored. Satraps negotiating with restive populations could invoke royal guarantees that meant something. The empire held together partly because its ruler was known to be trustworthy in a world where rulers frequently were not. By 530 BC, Cyrus had reigned for nearly 3 decades. He had united Persians and Medes, conquered Lydia and Babylon, incorporated the peoples of Central Asia into an empire that functioned with unprecedented smoothness. He had demonstrated that tolerance was not weakness, that mercy could be policy, that diverse peoples could be governed without being homogenized. He had built something that would outlast him, systems and traditions and expectations that his successors would inherit along with his territories. He was perhaps 70 years old, still vigorous, still commanding armies in person, still extending the boundaries of what he had built. The empire seemed secure. The succession seemed clear. The legacy seemed established. But the eastern frontiers remained unsettled, and the peoples beyond them had never acknowledged Persian authority. Cyrus gathered his forces for one more campaign. It would be his last. The Massagetæ lived beyond the northeastern boundaries of everything Cyrus had conquered. They were a nomadic people of the Central Asian steppes, dwelling in the vast grasslands east of the Caspian Sea, where the settled world gave way to endless horizons of wind and grass. They fought from horseback, lived in wagons, moved with their herds across territories that no empire had ever tried to govern. They had watched Persian power expand toward their borders, absorbing peoples who had once been their trading partners or their rivals, and they had no intention of being absorbed themselves. Their ruler was a woman named Tamiris. She had become queen after her husband's death, leading her people with an authority that Herodotus treats as unremarkable. The Massagetæ, apparently, found female rule neither strange nor problematic. When Cyrus sent envoys proposing marriage, she recognized the offer for what it was, not a genuine alliance, but a prelude to conquest, a way of gaining control without the expense of war. She refused. Cyrus gathered his forces and marched northeast into landscapes unlike anything his armies had faced before. The steppe offered no cities to capture, no temples to restore, no settled populations whose cooperation could stabilize conquest. The Massagetæ would not wait behind walls to be besieged. They would retreat into the endless grasslands, drawing Persian forces further from their supply lines, striking when advantage presented itself, vanishing before retaliation could find them. Traditional military methods would not work here. Cyrus would need something else. He chose deception. According to Herodotus, Cyrus advanced into Massagetæ territory and then staged a false retreat, leaving behind a camp stocked with wine and delicacies that steppe nomads rarely encountered. The Massagetæ, finding the camp apparently abandoned, celebrated their victory over the retreating Persians. They drank the wine, drinking heavily, unfamiliar with its potency, and fell into stupor. Cyrus returned and slaughtered them. Among the captives taken in this ambush was Spargapises, the son of Tamiris, commander of the Massagetæ forces. When the young prince sobered and understood what had happened, that he had been captured through a trick that exploited his people's unfamiliarity with Persian customs, he asked to be freed from his bonds. Cyrus granted the request. Spargapises killed himself rather than remain a prisoner. rather than be used as leverage against his mother. Thamyris sent a message to Cyrus that Herodotus preserves in words that echo across millennia. Glutton for blood, she called him. Give me back my son and leave this land unpunished. Refuse, and I swear by the sun, our master, that I will give you your fill of blood, no matter how insatiable you are. Cyrus did not withdraw. Perhaps he could not. To retreat after such a challenge would undermine the reputation for invincibility that held his empire together. Perhaps he believed that one more battle would finish what the ambush had begun. Perhaps the king, who had never lost, simply could not imagine losing now. The battle that followed was, in Herodotus's judgment, the fiercest ever fought between barbarian nations. The details are sparse. Ancient sources rarely provide the tactical clarity that modern readers want. But the outcome is certain. The Persian army was destroyed. Cyrus himself fell, though whether he died on the battlefield or was captured and executed afterward, the sources cannot agree. The king who had conquered the world met his end on the edges of it, brought down by a people who would not submit, and a queen who would not forgive. What Thamyris did with his body became legend. Herodotus reports that she had his corpse found among the dead, then filled a skin with human blood and plunged Cyrus's severed head into it. I am alive and have conquered you in fight, she said to the dead king, and yet by you am I ruined, for you took my son by guile. Now I fulfill my threat. I give you your fill of blood. Other ancient writers told different stories. Ctesias claimed Cyrus was wounded in battle against a different enemy entirely, lingered for 3 days, and died peacefully after arranging his succession. Xenophon, writing an idealized biography meant to educate Greek readers about kingship, described Cyrus dying in bed at an advanced age, dispensing final wisdom to his sons and passing away in tranquility. These alternative accounts may reflect Persian traditions that preferred a dignified death for their founder, or they may simply be inventions by authors who found Herodotus's version too humiliating. What seems certain is that Cyrus died in 530 BC in a campaign on the northeastern frontier, and that his body was eventually returned to Pasargadae for burial. The news spread across the empire like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. In Babylon, priests who had welcomed him as Marduk's chosen continued their rituals, uncertain what his death would mean for the tolerance they had enjoyed. In Jerusalem, Jews who had begun rebuilding their temple wondered whether his successor would honor the promises the founder had made. In Sardis and Ecbatana and Susa, satraps and officials calculated their positions, assessed their loyalties, prepared for a transition that would test whether the systems Cyrus had built could survive without him. His son Cambyses had been designated heir and was already exercising royal authority in Babylon. The succession, at least, would not be contested, not immediately. The empire would hold together. The institutions would continue functioning. The tribute would flow, and the roads would remain open, and the satraps would govern their provinces as they had always done. But something irreplaceable was gone. The man who had united the Persians and Medes, who had conquered Lydia and Babylon, who had demonstrated that empires could be built through tolerance as well as terror, that man would never again ride at the head of his armies, never again make decisions that shaped the fate of millions, never again embody in his person the unity that held so many peoples together. The empire remained. The king was dead. His body made the long journey home, to the heartland where he had been born, to the city he had built as a monument to Persian greatness. At Pasargadae, a tomb waited to receive him. The tomb was modest by the standards of ancient kings. A simple gabled structure of white limestone rose from a stepped platform, its design echoing nothing in Persian tradition. Some scholars see Anatolian influences, others Mesopotamian. As if even in death, Cyrus represented the synthesis of cultures he had achieved in life. The chamber inside was small, containing only a golden sarcophagus, a couch with golden feet, tapestries, and a table set with drinking vessels. No vast treasure, no armies of servants buried alongside him, no elaborate provisions for an afterlife journey. The man who had ruled the largest empire in history was laid to rest with restraint that matched the character the sources describe. An inscription reportedly marked the tomb's entrance. "O man, whoever you are and wherever you come from, for I know you will come. I am Cyrus, who founded the empire of the Persians. Do not grudge me this little earth that covers my body." The words, if Cyrus actually composed them, capture something essential about how he wished to be remembered. Not as a god demanding worship, but as a man asking only for the dignity that the dead deserve. The empire builder presented himself as mortal, his achievements subject to time, his resting place modest enough that visitors might wonder if it truly held someone who had conquered the world. Cambyses II inherited that world and immediately set about expanding it. Within 5 years of his father's death, he had accomplished what Cyrus never attempted, the conquest of Egypt. The last of the 4 great kingdoms that had divided the Near East fell to Persian arms in 525 BC, its ancient pharaonic traditions absorbed into the empire that now stretched from the Nile to the Indus. Cambyses became the first Persian king of Egypt, adding yet another crown to the titles his father had accumulated. But Cambyses died in 522 BC under circumstances that remain murky, possibly by his own hand, possibly through accident, possibly through conspiracy. What followed nearly destroyed everything Cyrus had built. A man claiming to be Bardia, Cyrus's younger son, seized the throne. Cambyses had allegedly had his brother secretly murdered years earlier, but now someone wearing Bardia's identity ruled from Ecbatana, and enough people believed the claim, or pretended to believe it, that the empire accepted him. When the truth emerged, if truth is what it was, a group of Persian nobles, led by a distant Achaemenid relative named Darius, overthrew the false Bardia and claimed the throne. Darius spent the early years of his reign suppressing revolts across the empire, rebellions that erupted when subject peoples saw the chaos at the center and calculated that Persian power might be breaking. He succeeded eventually and went on to rule for 36 years, expanding the empire further and establishing administrative systems that would endure for generations. But the succession crisis revealed the fragility that Cyrus's personal authority had concealed. The empire held together because Cyrus had made it hold together. Without him, it nearly flew apart. The memory of the founder became a political tool for everyone who came after. Darius emphasized his Achaemenid lineage, connecting himself to Cyrus even though the connection was distant. Subsequent kings presented themselves as heirs to the traditions Cyrus had established, guardians of the tolerance and justice he had practiced. The legitimacy that Cyrus had earned through his deeds became an inheritance that later rulers claimed simply by occupying his throne. Whether they actually practiced his policies mattered less than whether they invoked his name. Different peoples remembered him differently, each emphasizing what mattered most to their own traditions. The Persians preserved him as the founder, the father of the empire, the king who had united their scattered tribes and led them to dominance over the ancient world. The royal inscriptions at Pasargadae and elsewhere proclaimed his titles and achievements, though later kings, Darius especially, would overshadow him in the monuments they left behind. Persian tradition honored Cyrus, but did not deify him. He remained a man, the greatest of men, but human nonetheless. The Babylonians recorded him as a liberator, the king chosen by Marduk to restore proper worship and repair the damage that Nabonidus had done. The Cyrus cylinder preserved this version for posterity, its claims of divine selection and benevolent rule shaping how Mesopotamia understood the conquest. For Babylonian priests, Cyrus was proof that foreign rule need not mean religious oppression, a message they would invoke whenever subsequent Persian kings seemed inclined to forget. The Greeks, who would fight Persian armies for generations, nonetheless preserved a remarkable portrait of respect. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, when Greeks and Persians were enemies, treats Cyrus as a figure of genuine greatness, flawed, ultimately defeated, but worthy of admiration in ways that later Persian kings were not. The legendary birth, the dramatic conquests, the merciful treatment of defeated kings, all of this entered Greek historical consciousness through Herodotus and became part of how the Western world understood the Persian founder. Xenophon went further. His Cyropedia, The Education of Cyrus, presented an idealized biography that had little to do with historical accuracy and everything to do with political philosophy. Xenophon's Cyrus was the perfect ruler, just and wise and moderate, governing through consent rather than coercion, earning loyalty through virtue rather than demanding it through force. The book became one of the most influential political texts of antiquity, shaping how Greek and later Roman thinkers understood the possibilities of enlightened monarchy. The Cyropedia's influence extended far beyond the ancient world. Scipio Africanus reportedly carried a copy on campaign. Cicero admired it. Renaissance princes studied it as a manual for rule. Thomas Jefferson owned multiple copies and drew on its ideas when thinking about leadership and governance. The image of Cyrus as the philosopher king, ruling through wisdom and justice, entered Western political thought through Xenophon and never entirely left. The Jews preserved perhaps the most extraordinary memory of all. The Hebrew Bible names Cyrus as God's anointed, Mashiach, the word that becomes Messiah in English, making him the only non-Jew ever given this title in Scripture. The prophet Isaiah declares that God called Cyrus by name before he was born, that God took him by the right hand, that God opened doors before him so that he might accomplish divine purposes. The return from Babylon, the rebuilding of the temple, the restoration of Jewish life in Jerusalem, all of this was attributed to a pagan king whom God had chosen to serve Israel's redemption. This biblical memory ensured that Cyrus would be remembered in traditions far removed from ancient Persia. Christians inherited Jewish scriptures, and with them the image of the righteous pagan king. Islamic tradition, though it developed different accounts, preserved respect for the ruler who had treated Jews with justice. When European scholars rediscovered ancient history during the Renaissance, they found Cyrus waiting for them in Herodotus and Xenophon and the Bible alike. 2 centuries after Cyrus's death, another conqueror stood before his tomb. Alexander the Great, having destroyed the Persian Empire that Cyrus had founded, visited Pasargadae in 324 BC and found the tomb broken open, its contents scattered by looters. According to the ancient sources, Alexander was outraged. He ordered the tomb restored, its contents replaced as best they could be reconstructed, its guardians punished for their failure to protect it. The Macedonian king, who had conquered Persia, chose to honor the Persian king who had founded it. a gesture that recognized Cyrus as something more than an enemy, as a predecessor whose legacy demanded respect. Alexander may have seen something of himself in Cyrus, another conqueror from a peripheral kingdom who had defeated the great powers of his age, another builder of an empire that united peoples who had never before shared a ruler. If so, the comparison was apt. Both men transformed the world. Both died young, leaving empires that their successors would struggle to maintain. Both became legends that outlived the states they created. The tomb still stands. 25 centuries after Cyrus was laid to rest, the modest limestone structure rises from the plain at Pasargadae, weathered but intact, surrounded by the ruins of the city he built. Visitors still come, Iranian pilgrims honoring a national founder, tourists following the traces of ancient history, scholars seeking to understand what the stones can tell us that the texts cannot. In modern Iran, Cyrus has become a symbol of national identity that transcends the Islamic Revolution and connects contemporary Iranians to a pre-Islamic past. The Shah celebrated the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire in 1971, with ceremonies at Pasargadae, claiming Cyrus's legacy for his own regime. After the revolution, the tomb remained a pilgrimage site, its meaning contested, but its significance undiminished. Cyrus belongs to Iran in ways that politics cannot entirely control. The Cyrus cylinder has taken on new meanings in the modern world. When the United Nations was founded, some advocates claimed the cylinder as the first declaration of human rights, a 2,500-year-old precedent for the principles the new organization hoped to establish. The claim is historically dubious. The cylinder is propaganda for a conquering king, not a philosophical statement of universal rights, but it reflects something genuine. The recognition that Cyrus's policies represented a departure from the norms of ancient empire, a precedent for rulers who governed through accommodation rather than annihilation. Whether he deserves the title of history's first advocate for human rights matters less than why people want to give it to him. The longing for a ruler who was just, who was merciful, who built something that lasted without requiring constant brutality to maintain it. That longing reaches back across millennia to find in Cyrus an image of what power might be if power were wielded wisely. He was born into a world that did not expect him to matter, a younger son of a vassal king, a child marked for death by a grandfather's fear. He became the founder of the largest empire the ancient world had seen, a ruler remembered for mercy in an age when mercy was weakness, a king who conquered through competence and governed through tolerance. The legend says he should have died on a mountainside, exposed as an infant because a dream foretold his greatness. Instead, he lived, and the dream came true, and the vine that his grandfather saw growing from Mandane's womb did cover all of Asia. He lies now at Pasargadae, in the tomb he built for himself, asking only that visitors not grudge him the little earth that covers his body. The earth has not grudged him. The world has not forgotten him. Cyrus the Great, founder of Persia, king of kings. The man who showed that empires could be built on something other than fear. His memory endures. His example still instructs. And the tomb at Pasargadae still waits for whoever comes next, just as Cyrus said it would 25 centuries ago.